She traveled to a city that no longer exists on the map. According to documents, it was a dead land where life was impossible. But among the concrete ruins, she found a house where the lights were still on. What she discovered behind the overgrown walls changed not only her life, but also the truth that the whole city believed in. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. The morning light over the city was pale and cold, a thin veil of silver stretching across the rooftops as Evelyn Hayes stood by the kitchen counter, watching steam rise from her coffee. Her husband, Michael, sat at the table reading the newspaper, his glasses slipping down his nose, and their teenage son and daughter argued softly about whose turn it was to feed the dog. It was a scene she had seen hundreds of times before, ordinary, warm, grounded. But today, something inside her felt detached from it, as if she were standing behind glass, watching her own life play out. The file on the counter was the reason. The Department of Urban and Environmental Control had assigned her a field verification for a region called Riverside Industrial Zone, a name that had almost vanished from the city's maps after a decade of neglect. The report stated the land was uninhabitable due to contamination. Her task was to confirm it, take samples, and file an updated closure statement. A routine assignment on paper. Michael looked up when he noticed her gaze fixed on the manila folder. "Another one of those dead zone surveys?" he asked, folding his paper neatly. Evelyn nodded. "Riverside," she said. "The one by the old freight yard." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "That's miles outside the city. Didn't they seal that place off years ago?" She shrugged. "According to the files, yes. But the department wants a final verification before it's removed from the active register." Their daughter, Emma, muttered, without looking up from her phone. "Sounds spooky." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It's not spooky, sweetheart, just bureaucratic." Yet even as she said it, something about the assignment unsettled her. There was a line in the report that seemed off an unexplained date discrepancy, a signature she didn't recognize. She had made a career out of spotting inconsistencies, but lately she had learned to overlook them. It was easier that way. Still, something about Riverside tugged at her sense of duty. By the time she left home, the sky had turned gray. The city's glass towers faded behind her as she drove toward the industrial outskirts, where the air grew heavy with the smell of rust and damp concrete. Her department car hummed steadily along cracked asphalt roads that once carried endless convoys of trucks. Now they were silent except for the wind, pushing dry leaves across the pavement. Faded billboards leaned toward the highway, half swallowed by vines, their slogans for old soda brands barely legible. Riverside was 20 miles north, but as the miles slipped by, the world seemed to dissolve into something older and quieter. She passed clusters of abandoned houses, their windows black, roofs sagging under the weight of weeds. A metal sign marked the entrance to the district. Riverside Industrial Zone. No entry. It hung by a single rusted bolt, twisting slightly in the wind. Evelyn parked by the barrier and stepped out, the gravel crunching under her boots. The air was still, but not lifeless. She could hear distant birds, the hum of insects, the faint drip of water somewhere. She lifted her camera, taking wide shots of the skyline. The high-rise skeletons stood like fossils of another age, their concrete frames wrapped in vines. Nature had crept into every corner. It was strange, she thought, how the earth always found a way to reclaim what humans abandoned. She recorded soil coordinates on her tablet, then moved toward a half-finished tower. The ground was littered with cracked glass, rusted pipes, and sprouting grass. She crouched by a puddle to collect a water sample. The surface was clear, and when she sniffed it lightly, a reflex from years of field work, she detected no chemical odor. The reports had claimed contamination, yet the evidence in front of her spoke otherwise. She noted the observation in her notebook, though she knew no one would read it carefully. Reports were signed and archived, not studied. Still, she did her job properly. That was what kept her going. She was walking toward her car when she heard it. Laughter. A child's laugh, brief and bright, echoing off the concrete. Evelyn froze, the hair on her arms prickling. She turned slowly toward the nearest building. It was one of the taller towers, its open floors gaping like missing teeth. She waited. The sound came again, clearer this time, drifting down the stairwell. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the courtyard. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke. Her flashlight beam caught dusty graffiti on the walls, old furniture, scattered cans. Then, halfway up the staircase, she noticed footprints. Small ones, lighter than an adult's. At the 6th floor landing, she paused. There was light coming from a doorway, warm, flickering. She stepped closer, and the smell of wood smoke grew stronger. Through the half-open door, she saw what no report had ever mentioned. A home. Not in any formal sense, but a space carefully reclaimed from ruin. A curtain made of old bed sheets divided the room. A pot simmered on a portable stove. Blankets were neatly folded on the floor, and children's drawings covered one wall. Houses, flowers, a sun smiling over green hills. A little boy sat cross-legged on the floor, stacking blocks from a broken crate. When he saw her, he froze. "Mama!" he shouted. A woman appeared almost instantly, wiping her hands on a towel. She was in her early 30s, her face pale and tired, but not defeated. "Who are you?" she demanded, stepping in front of the boy. Evelyn raised her hand slightly. "It's okay. I'm with the city's environmental department. I didn't know anyone was here." The woman frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Nobody is supposed to be here. That's what they said. So we came." The words didn't quite make sense until Evelyn asked softly, "You live here?" The woman nodded. "We have nowhere else. The rent in the city is impossible. They said this place was poisoned, but look." She gestured toward a small planter near the window, where green shoots sprouted through soil. "Nothing is poisoned. We grow our food. My husband fixed the pipes. The water is clean." A man appeared from the adjoining room, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands, holding a coil of wire. "I told you not to open the door for anyone," he said quietly. His tone wasn't hostile, only protective. Evelyn introduced herself again, explaining that she wasn't there to evict anyone. "I'm just verifying environmental reports," she said, "but the files state this area is uninhabitable." The man gave a dry laugh. "Uninhabitable? We've been breathing this air for a year. My children are healthy. The soil gives us vegetables. You tell me what's uninhabitable about that." He said his name was Jose, and his wife was Lydia. Their children, Daniel and Sophia, peeked at her shyly from behind a stack of blankets. Evelyn asked if she could test their water. Lydia hesitated, then nodded. They watched as she filled a small vial from their metal sink. The water was clear, cold. She marked it, then looked around the room again. There was a quiet dignity to the space. The broom leaning against the wall, the patched-up windows, the small shelf of books. It wasn't comfort, but it was life. "Why stay here?" Evelyn asked softly. Lydia glanced at her husband. "Because here, nobody bothers us. In the city, we were invisible, living in a shelter. Here we are invisible in peace." As she left, Daniel ran after her with a drawing. "This is our house," he said proudly, showing her a picture of a tall building with flowers growing on its walls. Evelyn smiled and thanked him. In her car, she sat for a long moment, staring at the half-finished towers around her. The documents she carried said the place was dead. But she had just spoken to 4 living souls whose lives depended on that lie. The thought settled heavily in her chest as she drove away. The road out of Riverside was quiet except for the hum of tires and the distant chirping of birds. Twilight fell slowly, washing the ruins in soft gold. Evelyn looked in the rearview mirror and saw the district receding behind her, a green labyrinth reclaiming its bones. She wondered how many other places on the map had been declared lifeless, simply because someone, somewhere, had found profit in their silence. By the time she reached the highway, the city lights were visible again, faint and flickering on the horizon. She felt as though she were crossing between 2 worlds, one buried in vines and truth, the other polished in glass and deceit. When she got home, Michael was waiting in the living room, grading papers. He looked up as she entered. "How was the trip?" he asked. Evelyn paused in the doorway, then said quietly, "The reports were wrong." He studied her face for a moment. "Wrong how?" She shook her head, sinking into the armchair. "There are people living there, a family, children." Michael put his papers aside. "But it's condemned land." "Exactly," she replied. "Condemned on paper." For a while, neither of them spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, and the clock on the wall ticked evenly. At last he said, "You'll check the files again tomorrow?" She nodded. "I have to. Something isn't right." That night, lying awake beside him, Evelyn stared at the ceiling and thought about the drawings on the walls, the children's laughter echoing through concrete corridors, and the words she had read 1,000 times in official documents, uninhabitable. It was strange how language could erase existence. She thought of Lydia's calm defiance, Jose's rough hands, the stubborn green plants growing where nothing was supposed to grow. Outside, the city buzzed softly, unaware that a few miles away, life was quietly refusing to die. And Evelyn, who had spent years following protocols, felt something stir inside her again, a small, dangerous thing she had almost forgotten. Conviction. In the darkness, Michael turned toward her and murmured half asleep, "You'll figure it out." Evelyn closed her eyes. "I think it's already figured me out," she whispered. The night deepened, and the first faint sound of rain brushed against the windows, steady and low, as if the world itself were reminding her that nothing stays buried forever. The next morning began quietly, but Evelyn's mind was far from calm. She woke before dawn, lying still in the gray half-light, watching the faint outline of her husband beside her. Michael slept peacefully, his breathing slow and steady, but she could not close her eyes again. The faces from the abandoned building, Lydia's guarded stare, Jose's steady hands, the children's cautious smiles drifted through her thoughts like ghosts that refused to be dismissed. It was absurd, she told herself. A family living in a condemned district wasn't her problem. It was a bureaucratic error, nothing more. Still, the unease in her chest wouldn't fade. Somewhere, a truth had been buried beneath the paperwork, and she could feel it pressing upward, insisting to be seen. By the time she reached the office, the day had brightened into a dull metallic gray. The Department of Urban and Environmental Control occupied a bland concrete building downtown, its windows tinted to hide the fluorescent light inside. As she passed through security and greeted the receptionist, she felt the familiar dull rhythm of routine settle over her, the scent of paper, the whir of printers, the distant ringing of telephones. Everything in this place existed to preserve appearances. The files, the signatures, the stamps, all were meant to create the illusion that order and truth were the same thing. She knew better. At her desk, she opened the Riverside file again. The documents stared back at her with their sterile precision. Contamination reports, laboratory analyses, official photographs of cracked soil and empty streets. Each page bore a name, a signature, a date. Yet the more she looked, the more the structure began to crumble. The same laboratory, Cleantech Environmental Services, was listed on multiple reports, but the addresses didn't match. 2 signatures were identical, copied pixel by pixel. One analysis was dated on a Sunday, when government offices were closed. She felt a chill run through her as she compared the signatures side by side. Someone had fabricated entire sections. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. In the past, she might have ignored it, written it off as a clerical error. But now, she had seen the people who would suffer for that lie. On paper, they didn't exist. In the real world, they were simply invisible. She printed out several pages and tucked them into her briefcase. Around her, her colleagues moved through the motions of another day typing, sipping coffee, exchanging small talk. No one noticed that the woman at the corner desk was quietly dismantling the foundation of a deception far larger than her job title. At lunch, she called an old friend, Richard, who ran an independent environmental testing lab on the west side of the city. They hadn't spoken in years, not since he'd left government work out of frustration. "Evelyn Hayes," he said when he recognized her voice, "you've either found something or you're in trouble." "Maybe both," she replied. She explained briefly about Riverside, the contamination reports, the inconsistencies, the people living there. Richard whistled softly. "Cleantech. That company's been gone for years. Filed for bankruptcy after a fraud case. If their name's on your reports, someone's using them as a front. Can you test some samples for me?" she asked. "I took them myself yesterday. Bring them by, and Evelyn, be careful. If someone's forging data on that scale, they're not afraid of bending rules to keep it buried." When she hung up, her pulse was faster than before. The pieces were beginning to align in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Still, she couldn't stop. That evening, after most of her co-workers had left, she placed the small vials of soil and water into her bag and left the building through the rear entrance. The following morning, she drove to Richard's lab, a modest building tucked between an auto shop and a warehouse. Inside, the air smelled faintly of alcohol and metal. Richard, older now and heavier around the middle, greeted her with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's see what we're dealing with," he said, gesturing to a counter lined with equipment. They spent the morning running tests. The results were clear before the machines even finished printing. The levels of contaminants were negligible, far below the thresholds listed in the official report. The water sample was almost pristine, cleaner than what came from most city taps. Evelyn stared at the numbers, her stomach tightening. "There's no contamination," she said quietly. "None," Richard confirmed. "Whoever wrote those reports didn't just exaggerate. They invented the data. This land isn't toxic. It's valuable." He handed her a printed summary, but his tone was cautious. "If I were you, I'd tread lightly. There's money behind this kind of falsification. Big money." She thanked him and left, gripping the papers tightly as if they might vanish. On the drive back, her mind raced. A condemned district meant low-value land, cheap to buy, easy to clear, no public interference. But if the area wasn't dangerous, then the declaration of uninhabitability was a deliberate act. Someone had poisoned the truth, not the soil. That night, she laid the documents on the kitchen table. Michael read them slowly, adjusting his glasses. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "They want people to think it's dead ground," he said. "Then they'll buy it for nothing and rebuild it for the rich." Evelyn nodded. "There's a company connected to it, Northwell Development. They've been acquiring plots all around the city. But this one's different. It's been locked by the Environmental Bureau for a decade. If they can get it reclassified as safe for redevelopment, the profit will be enormous. Michael leaned back, crossing his arms. And your department's helping them. She hesitated. Maybe not openly, but they're closing their eyes. The original lab doesn't exist. The signatures are forged. Everyone's pretending not to see. What will you do? I don't know yet, she admitted, but I can't ignore it. He was silent for a moment, then said softly, You always told me honesty wasn't a belief. It was a responsibility. Maybe it's time to prove that. The next day, Evelyn walked into her department with a sense of quiet resolve. She spent the morning in the archive room, copying every Riverside document she could find. Memos, inspection forms, invoices, even interoffice emails. At noon, she knocked on her supervisor's door. Mr. Garrett was a thin man with careful eyes and a permanent air of fatigue. He motioned her to sit without looking up from his screen. Evelyn, you're working on Riverside, correct? Yes, she said, setting a folder on his desk. There are serious inconsistencies in the data. The contamination reports don't match any verifiable testing. The lab doesn't exist, and I believe the signatures were copied. The land isn't polluted. Garrett's hands froze above the keyboard. Slowly, he leaned back, studying her. You've been thorough, as always. But let me give you some advice. Don't pursue this. Sir, if we submit falsified data, that's a federal offense. He smiled faintly, a tired, humorless smile. You're assuming it's falsified. I'm telling you the matter is closed. We're not authorized to revisit it. Then who authorized the closure? He didn't answer. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope. Take a few days off, he said. You've been under pressure. This is not your fight. Evelyn looked at the envelope and understood. It wasn't a reward. It was a warning. There are people living there, she said quietly. Children. Garrett's eyes hardened. There are no residents in Riverside. The census confirms it. Don't let sentiment interfere with your judgment. When she left his office, her legs felt unsteady. In the hallway, fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everything in a flat, lifeless glow. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked down at the city. Cars moved like slow streams of light. People hurried along the sidewalks, and somewhere far beyond those streets was a family invisible to all of this. A family whose very existence was a threat to someone's profit. That evening, she drove back to Riverside. The sun was low, painting the buildings in gold and rust. The same quiet greeted her, though now she sensed a different kind of stillness, one holding its breath. Lydia was outside, tending to a small garden box filled with green shoots. She looked up, wary but not surprised. You came back, she said. I needed to, Evelyn replied. I have to tell you something. They went inside, where Jose was mending a broken chair. The children sat on the floor, drawing. Evelyn explained everything, the false reports, the upcoming redevelopment, the risk that the land would soon be seized. Lydia listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When Evelyn finished, she asked, What will they do to us? They'll call it evacuation, Evelyn said softly, but it's eviction. They'll say the land is unsafe, and then they'll demolish it. Jose clenched his jaw. They think because we're poor, we'll disappear quietly. Evelyn met his gaze. I won't let that happen. I can file an independent report, document everything. It might not stop them, but it will create a record they can't erase easily. Lydia nodded slowly, though her eyes were filled with fear. We trust you, she said. But please, be careful. People like us vanish without notice. Don't become one of us. As Evelyn left, she noticed marks on the nearby walls. Bright orange circles sprayed onto the concrete, the kind used by demolition crews. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They were already preparing to clear the area. She drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past the windshield. At a red light, she caught sight of her own reflection-tired eyes, determined mouth. She didn't recognize herself, and yet, she thought, maybe this was who she had always been before she learned to compromise. At home, Michael was waiting by the window. He didn't ask what happened. He saw the truth in her face. "You can't let it go, can you?" he said. "No," she answered simply. "Because if I do, I'll become like them." He came to her, took her hand, and said, "Then we'll face it together." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, they sat at the dining table surrounded by papers. Michael helped her organize the evidence reports, signatures, photographs. They worked quietly, side by side, like conspirators in a cause neither fully understood, but both believed in. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly on the windows. Evelyn looked at her husband and felt a small spark of courage. Tomorrow she would submit her own report, the real one. Whatever came after, she would face it standing up. When she finally went to bed, exhaustion pulled at her, but sleep refused to come. She thought of Lydia's warning, of the orange circles on the walls, of the silent power that turned truth into ash. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the storm was only beginning. The rain had already stopped by the time dawn arrived, leaving the streets slick and pale beneath the light of a tired sun. Evelyn woke before the alarm, her mind still tangled in the same thoughts that had haunted her through the night. The documents, the signatures, the faces of Lydia's children, they wove together into something heavy and inescapable. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long while before she finally rose, dressed, and went to the window. Down below, the city was already stirring, indifferent as ever. Cars moved in smooth lines. People hurried to work. Coffee vendors shouted their morning prices. No one would have guessed that only a few miles away, there was a district that existed only in silence, a place that had been erased not by disaster, but by design. Michael was in the kitchen, pouring coffee when she came in. He looked up at her with quiet understanding. There was no need for questions. "You're going back today, aren't you?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "I have to deliver my report. If I stay silent, they'll close the file, and it'll be as if none of it ever existed." He set the mug in front of her, the smell of dark roast filling the room. "Then make sure it's the truth, and make sure they can't bury it again." The drive to the department felt longer than usual. She knew every crack in the pavement now, every billboard, every intersection. But today, the familiar cityscape seemed like a stranger. When she reached the office, the parking lot was half empty, the building's concrete walls still damp from the storm. She climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, her briefcase clutched tight against her chest. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the hum of computers filled the air. It could have been any other morning, but she felt as though she were walking into the heart of something dark and immense. She went directly to her desk, opened her computer, and began to type. The new report was simple, factual, methodical. She described the condition of the soil, the clarity of the water, the absence of any traceable contamination. She included photographs, timestamps, GPS coordinates. Then, at the end, she added an addendum, a statement verifying that the district was not abandoned, that human habitation persisted despite the official classification. She didn't use names, but she made it clear that the so-called uninhabitable zone was, in truth, home to a family who had nowhere else to go. She ended the report with a line she hadn't planned to write. "This land is not dead. It is being deliberately silenced." She saved it, printed 2 copies, and walked to her supervisor's office. The door was half open. Garrett was inside, speaking quietly with a man in an expensive gray suit. They stopped when she knocked. The man turned slightly, his expression impassive, his eyes cold in a practiced way. "Ms. Hayes," Garrett said after a pause, his voice a shade too calm. "We were just discussing Riverside." Evelyn set the folder on the desk. "Here's my final report. You'll find the contamination claims unsupported by evidence. I've attached the independent lab results and my field photographs." The man in the suit picked up the file, leafed through it without reading. "You're very thorough," he said. "That's admirable, but unnecessary." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "Unnecessary?" He smiled faintly. "The district is already designated for redevelopment. The environmental clearance has been approved." "That clearance is based on forged data," she said evenly, "and it violates federal land use protocols." Garrett's voice was quiet, almost pleading. "Evelyn, please. This isn't your fight. The decision's been made above us. You can't change it." "I'm not trying to change it," she said. "I'm documenting the truth." The man in the suit placed the folder back on the desk. "Then document it somewhere else, because if this report leaves this office, you'll be out of a job by the end of the week." She met his gaze steadily. "If that's the price, I'll pay it." He smiled again, this time with genuine amusement. Idealists always say that, until they realize idealism doesn't pay the mortgage. Then he turned to Garrett. "Handle it." When he left, Garrett exhaled heavily, rubbing his forehead. "Evelyn, listen to me. You're a good employee, one of the best I've had. But these people, you don't understand the scale of this. Northwell owns half the city council, and the rest owe them favors. If you keep pushing, they'll crush you." She stood silent for a moment, then said, "Maybe they will, but they won't erase me quietly." And she walked out. By mid-afternoon, her email access was revoked. The department database no longer showed her report. The digital version had been deleted, replaced by a short, sanitized statement, with her name still attached to it, though she had never written a word of it. It claimed that all contamination data had been verified, and that Riverside remained unsuitable for redevelopment due to environmental instability. The lie had folded back on itself neatly, as if swallowing her whole. That evening, she sat in her car outside the office, watching the lights go out one by one. The city skyline was reflected faintly in the wet pavement. She took out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Sarah Mitchell, the journalist Michael had once taught in his university class, now a reporter for an independent investigative outlet. They hadn't spoken in years, but when Sarah answered, her voice was still brisk and curious. "Evelyn Hayes, I remember you. You're the one who used to check my sources when I exaggerated." "I need you to check mine now," Evelyn said quietly. They met an hour later in a small diner near the river. The place smelled of coffee and fried onions. Sarah wore a trench coat and had that look of someone who never stopped thinking, even while she smiled. Evelyn handed her a flash drive and a folder of printed documents, the original test results, photographs, forged signatures, and the false reports. Sarah flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing. "This is huge," she said. "If this is real, it's criminal fraud, maybe even federal-level corruption. You're sure about this?" "I was there," Evelyn said. "I met the people who live there. They'll be forced out any day now." Sarah closed the folder. "Then we need to act fast. I'll verify everything before publishing, but you understand what happens next, right? Once this goes public, you'll be exposed. They'll come after you." "I understand," Evelyn said. "Just make sure the story reaches daylight." On her way home, she passed the dark outline of Riverside in the distance, visible only as a shadow against the horizon. The towers rose like ghosts, half swallowed by the night. The memory of Daniel's drawing came back to her, the building covered in flowers, the smiling sun above it. she whispered a silent promise to the darkness. They would not vanish. Not again. The following night, she and Michael returned to the district. The air smelled of damp earth, and the moon hung low over the rooftops. They parked at the edge of the overgrown road and walked in silence toward the building. The windows glowed faintly with the light of a single lantern. Lydia was outside, gathering belongings into a worn suitcase. When she saw them, her face tightened. "They came today," she said. "Men in trucks. They marked every building with red paint. Said demolition starts in 2 days. Jose appeared behind her, his expression grim. "We can't stop them." "Yes, you can," Evelyn said. "You have to leave tonight. Go somewhere safe. There's a story coming out tomorrow that might change everything, but until then, you can't be here." They hesitated, exchanging a look that spoke of exhaustion and fear. Then Jose nodded. "We'll go. There's a friend in the next town who owes me a favor." Michael helped them carry their few possessions, a bag of clothes, a box of tools, a rolled-up mattress to their rusted pickup truck. The children climbed in silently. Before they left, Daniel leaned out of the window and handed Evelyn another drawing. This one showed a tree growing through a cracked building, its branches full of green leaves. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. When the truck disappeared down the road, Evelyn stood for a long while watching the taillights fade into the dark. Michael touched her shoulder. "You did what you could," he said. "Now, let the truth do the rest." The next morning, the story broke. The headline ran across every major outlet within hours. "The Dead District That Breathes. Fraud, Lies, and the Human Cost of Redevelopment." Sarah's article was precise and devastating. It named names, traced the money, exposed the falsified documents, and described the families who had been erased for profit. Evelyn's testimony was quoted in full. By afternoon, government officials were scrambling to issue statements. Northwell's stock value plummeted. The city announced an immediate suspension of all construction plans pending investigation. But by the end of the week, Evelyn received a formal notice of termination from the department, restructuring due to internal review. It didn't surprise her. What surprised her was how calm she felt reading it. When she told Michael, he simply nodded and said, "We expected as much." In the following weeks, she received messages from strangers, activists, teachers, even other inspectors, thanking her for what she'd done. Some called her brave, others reckless. She ignored both labels. She hadn't been either. She had simply done what the job demanded before the job forgot its own meaning. Months passed. The investigation dragged on, but progress was slow. The city council promised transparency, the corporations promised cooperation, and the public soon moved on to other scandals. Yet one afternoon, as she drove past the outskirts, she saw something new. The barriers around Riverside were gone, replaced by signs bearing the city seal. Protected Environmental Restoration Area. No development permitted. She stopped the car and got out. The air smelled different. Fresh. Alive. Grass had begun to grow between the cracks in the road, and wildflowers dotted the fields. The towers still stood, but vines had climbed higher, softening their edges. She walked through the ruins, her footsteps echoing faintly. For the first time, she felt no fear or sadness here. Only peace. Near the base of one building, she found a small painted rock, a child's toy, maybe left behind by Daniel or Sophia. She picked it up and smiled. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Lydia. The family had settled in a small house outside the city. The children were in school. "We're safe," the message said. "Thank you for not forgetting us." Evelyn stared at the screen for a long time, her throat tightening. As the evening light stretched across the skyline, she turned toward the horizon. The city's glass towers glittered in the distance, but behind her, The old district shimmered green under the setting sun. Michael's words from months ago came back to her. Sometimes, to save something living, you have to risk your comfort. She walked slowly back to her car, breathing in the scent of wet earth and growing things. The silence around her was no longer the silence of abandonment, but of renewal. The land had been declared dead, erased from maps, condemned by greed, and yet it lived. Just like the people who had refused to vanish, just like the truth she had refused to bury. As she drove away, she glanced once more in the rearview mirror. The towers glowed faintly in the twilight, their broken windows catching the last light of day. It looked almost like the district was breathing. Evelyn smiled then, a small, tired smile that held both loss and peace. What remained behind her wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos for new stories every week, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.